It's certainly true that the United States needs to engage in a much more multilateral and cooperative and partnership-oriented way in the world. And what the good news is that, I think important and influential people on both sides of the political aisle are really aware of that, and they're looking for ways to do that. So the idea of a league or concert of democracy springs from a good instinct, which is we've got to reconnect. And both parties realize that candidates on both sides. So that's great. I do happen to think that this particular form, though, will likely be a distraction because it doesn't create an institution that I think would really work very effectively on peace and security issues. It would be rejected by a number of countries that are important to us that would be very wary about joining the United States in such an initiative. I don't think there's any appetite out there in the world today for a new association of countries which is based around a US-led ideological framework or a US-led sort of ideological orientation in which some countries are included and excluded based on judgments, political judgments about their domestic political systems. And I think this league would find itself with a very difficult choice. If it were inclusive and really let in lots of democracies, it would find that the lowest common denominator is so low in terms of common interests and perspectives that it would really have a hard time finding many things to work effectively on. So either you're very inclusive and the lowest common denominator is very low, or you're quite exclusive and just say, no, we're only going to let in countries that really basically agree with a fundamental sort of US global security agenda. In which case, the world would say, is this really a League of Democracies or is this just a League of American Friends? And I think that the institution would really lack credibility in that sense. Behind the League of Democracies is very much the idea of democratic peace, that given that democracies tend not to fight with each other, they are natural partners to some extent in a peaceful league of saying, we are not going to fight with each other because we share these common values. That's fine, but the problem is that an effective way to go out and address the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? What to do in Iraq next, how to confront Iran's nuclear ambitions, how to tackle climate change. Yes, democratic peace is an important phenomenon, but trying to create an alternative peace and security institution, alternative to the United Nations, which excludes Russia, China, Vietnam, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and so forth, and say, now we're going to tackle the issues of peace and security in the world, strikes me as a difficult and probably bad way to proceed. I don't think we can say that the United Nations is a total failure and we're simply going to walk away from it and create our own little international institution sandbox and play in that instead. Other countries are not going to have an interest in joining up with the United States in an initiative if they feel that it is based on essentially an effort to gut the United Nations and go around the United Nations on peace and security issues. Yes, the United States has been troubled. Yes, it falls short of expectations. But most countries in the world want to continue to try to work on peace and security issues through a universal institution to the extent possible, not a US-led exclusive institution which rules out members with which the United States does not feel politically compatible. What's interesting here is there are really two different conceptions of a League of Democracies at work. One sounds, when you hear Senator McCain talk about the League of Democracies, he really is talking about an institution that would be so broad-based and so sort of ample in its mandate that it really does look like something attempting to supplant the United Nations. He talks about a League of Democracies that would impose sanctions on Iran, that would help in the effort that he believes should be undertaken to marginalize Hugo Chavez in South America, that should work on Darfur. He talks about economic access and so forth. So I think one conception that's coming a bit more from the conservative side of the political aisle in the United States is for a very broad, sort of ample conception of League of Democracies that can really well be seen as an effort to supplant the United Nations. From the Democratic side of the political aisle, I think the effort is a bit more focused just on use of force, peace and security, sort of a stepping stone to global NATO, but not necessarily trying to address all different kinds of issues. And there the talk is a bit more about an institution in which the United States would tailor its own ambitions and tailor its own policies to meet the constraints that other countries might want to apply on it. And other countries would gain more access to US policy. So there's sort of a softer, somewhat less ambitious conception on that side. So what's interesting in an election year is you say there's some interest on both sides of the political aisle for this idea. But when you look carefully, you see that there are actually still quite different instincts behind the two sides. So I think we have to look at existing fora and see what's possible. Where necessary on things like climate change, if we're going to find ways to really bring the world together around climate change, we're either going to have to take innovative approaches to existing fora or create new ones that are highly inclusive. But like I say, we can't give up on the United Nations and say it's failed, we're going to walk away from it, if we're simply going to replace it with an institution that's US-led, ideologically oriented, exclusive, and so forth.
We live in a globalized world, interconnected, in which events and developments far away have an immediate impact here at home, potentially devastating. And in that world, we need to have partners internationally to deal with the problems out there. Existing international institutions can solve some of these problems some of the time, but the most capable partners are the democracies around the world, both in Europe and Asia, where we have long-standing alliances. But increasingly, we need democracies around the world, in India and Brazil and Latin America and South Africa, to work together with the United States to solve problems of common concerns. So somehow we need to figure out, how do we get global partners? And why not choose the ones that are most likely to share our values, that when they cooperate with us are most likely to share our interests, and work with them both to improve existing institutions and to provide means of addressing real problems together. I think it would do a number of different things. First and most importantly, the countries within the concert would cooperate on helping to change, reform, and adapt existing international institutions, starting with the United Nations. Wouldn't it be nice if, on the questions of human rights and democracy, countries that actually respect human rights and are democratic were to agree, rather than to figure out whether you have an African vote or some other regional vote? Secondly, it would be about promoting democracy by having a club that has of democratic countries, that has strong ties among the countries. You are creating incentives for others perhaps to change their political systems and to adapt and change in ways that make it more likely that they become members. Third, it is about the democracies in the world are those who have the greatest financial resources and the greatest number of the greatest wealth to be used for economic development and sustainability, which they would be better able to do if they were to coordinate their practices and include not only Western countries that have traditionally tried to cooperate, but also countries that have come up in more recent years and developed in more recent years in the South. And finally, it's about a security dialogue, about terrorism, about proliferation, and indeed, even down the road on the question of when and how to use force, not as a decision-making organ to replace existing institutions, but at least to start to have a dialogue on under what circumstances force might be a legitimate form of solving problems. I'm not looking for an organization that supplants the United Nations. I'm looking for an organization that can make the United Nations more effective, both by having the membership of the Concert of Democracies work within that organization to force, to try to persuade people to reform the organization, to adapt it to the current world, and to make it a more effective means of action in the world. But there will be times in which the United Nations either cannot agree or the issues are beyond the United Nations to address, and which a smaller organization may like, and where the interests and values are shared to a greater degree, may be more effective, and indeed for the people who are belong to the Concert of Democracies, more legitimate in acting. Well, originally, the Community of Democracies was fundamentally focused on democracy promotion only. What I'm talking about is, how do you enhance international cooperation in a globalized world with issues that may not, in many instances, won't have anything to do with democracy promotion around the world. So that's one key difference. However, the community democracies might well be a central part either of the concert, or indeed become the basis for out of which one could grow a concert of democracies that has larger interests and larger capabilities and larger concerns to be addressed than just the ones that have been traditional among the communities. One of the things in the community democracies that has changed for the better is it started off as an organization that was in many ways too large, that had invited countries that frankly aren't democracies, and now over time it has developed a set of criteria that are more stringent, and the membership invitation list tends to be smaller and more focused on what countries that are true democracies. That's a step forward. I thought Tom made a number of very valid points, but I think I disagree in two fundamental ways. One is, I don't think that the Concert of Democracies is first and foremost about democracy promotion. There are many different ways in which you could do that. And second is the notion that democracies disagree, as they in fact do these days, on a whole host of issues. That's true. But one of the the real reasons why you want to have an institution is that institutions tend to change and socialize countries in their behavior and in their interests. And over time, the value of the institution, of maintaining membership in the institution, becomes a consideration in how countries decide on particular issues. And that even when they disagree in a particular course of action, they are willing to find a way to compromise and in fact come up with a better policy in order to maintain that unity of the alliance. That's the history of NATO for the last 60 years. And frankly, I think it's one we can replicate in the case of the Concert of Democracies.
I think the question is whether or not we are institutionally well served by what we have or whether there are opportunities to improve the way the system works. And if you look at the success of the European Union in terms of bringing Central and Eastern Europe into Western institutions, if you look at the success of NATO along the same lines, and you ask, well, how do we replicate that on a global scale? What do we do? What encouragements can we offer? And how do we do it? And I think the answer to that question is not obvious under the current institutional architecture. And so I think what we would get out of a League of Democracies or a Concert of Democracies is the ability to replicate those kinds of outcomes on a broader scale. The Community of Democracies is a hugely important initiative, and its only problem is that it's relatively institutionally weak. And so I think that this could easily become an outgrowth of the Community of Democracies and the principle that animates it. But I think at some point, and this is the key point, you really do have to have a treaty, something that actually binds the members of this institution together, something that provides a real secretariat and a real robust decision-making body, and those are the things that are missing from the Community of Democracies at the moment. And I would hope that that you'd certainly want to explore how a League of Democracies or a Concert of Democracies could be an outgrowth of what the community has already done in terms of solidarity on values questions. Does that mean everybody agrees on everything? No, of course not. I would expect that there to be pretty robust disagreements on certain kinds of things, but there won't be a disagreement over whether it's good to have a democracy. There won't be a disagreement over whether it's a good thing for a democracy to devolve into a more authoritarian kind of regime. Tom makes very important critical points, but I think that those are points that have answers. And obviously this is not an easy initiative. Nothing on this scale ever is. And obviously people are going to raise objections to it. But I think if you look at the ways in which democracies are trying to cooperate now, not only in existing institutions, but also on a kind of affinity basis, whether it's dealing with major disasters or other kinds of questions, there's already a kind of will there. In addition, there's the long-standing practice of democracies remaining at peace with each other. And I think that these are things on which we can build and things that we ought to ratify and codify.